I'm going to jump right into our reading, our text for this morning. So if you've got a Bible, you can turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 29, or you can use your phone. Just Google 1 Chronicles 29, NLT. That's the version we tend to use. Or failing all of those, we'll whack it on the screen for you. Here we go. Let me read starting at verse 6, running through verse 20. Then the family leaders, the leaders of the tribes of Israel, the generals and captains of the army, and the king's administrative officers all gave willingly. For the construction of the temple of God, they gave about 188 tons of gold, 10,000 gold coins. Wow, this is getting intimidating. 375 tons of silver, 675 tons of bronze, and 3,750 tons of iron. They also contributed numerous precious stones, which were deposited in the treasury of the house of the Lord under the care of Jehiel, a descendant of Gershon. The people rejoiced over the offerings, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord, and King David was filled with joy. Then David praised the Lord in the presence of the whole assembly. O Lord, the God of our ancestor Israel, may you be praised forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. Everything in the heavens and on earth is yours, O Lord, and this is your kingdom. We adore you as the one who is over all things. Wealth and honor come from you alone, for you rule over everything. Power and might are in your hand, and at your discretion people are made great and given strength. O our God, we thank you and praise your glorious name. But who am I and who are my people that we could give you anything? Everything we have has come from you, and we give you only what you first gave us. But we are here only for a moment, visitors and strangers in the land as our ancestors were before us. Our days on earth are like a passing shadow, gone so soon without a trace. O Lord God, even this material we have gathered to build a temple to honor your holy name comes from you. It all belongs to you. I know, my God, that you examine our hearts and rejoice when you find integrity there. You know I have done all of this with good motives, and I have watched your people offer their gifts willingly and joyously. O Lord, the God of our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, make your people always want to obey you. See to it that their love for you never changes. Give my son Solomon the wholehearted desire to obey all your commands, laws, and decrees, and to do everything necessary to build this temple for which I have made these preparations. Before we jump in, I'm going to pray. And for some of you who have followed Jesus for a while, you'll realize that what we do on Sunday mornings is actually extraordinary. We gather here and we expect God by his Spirit to show up, to inhabit, that's what the Bible says, to inhabit the songs we sing, to inhabit our praises, and to speak to us. Which if you haven't grown up following Jesus, if this is new to you, that is really weird sounding. And I want to explain quickly why it's rational for us. For those who trust Jesus, it's rational to expect him to speak to us. If we believe that he exists, and if we believe that he inspired these words to be written thousands of years ago, and if we believe he is making good on his promise to be here among us, then it only makes sense to ask him to speak through this to us, to help us understand it in a way that is authoritative, a way that is powerful to affect our lives today. Like your actual lives, your life in this neighborhood, your life in your cube, your life on your couch at home, your life, where you live it, that it should be affected. That's what we expect. And so I'm going to pray to that end. If you believe that with me, you can pray along with me in your hearts. If you don't believe that, that's fine. I'll be right back with you. Father, by the power of your Spirit, I invite you to speak to us. We ask that you would make our hearts ready to guzzle your word this morning. I pray that you would protect my mouth, that what I say would be from you rather than just Ian. I pray that you would protect our hearts, help us to sift what is from you. Help us to cling to your voice in our lives. And help us to submit ourselves to it eagerly, lovingly, joyfully, courageously. For the glory of your Son, for the good of our city, we pray. Amen. If you were with us last week, you'll know we started into this series on plan to stay. Plan to stay, you might know, is a phrase that we've lifted from the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. The Old Testament prophet Jeremiah writes to God's people who find themselves in the big city, overwhelming city of Babylon. It's not their hometown. They don't want to be there. Realistically, it's actually a pretty great city. Objectively, it's probably better than the city they've come from, but nonetheless, it does not feel like home. It certainly is not aligned with their central values of obeying and loving God. Nothing about the society in Babylon is encouraging them to line up their lives behind the single-hearted love of God. And so, the prophet writes to them, and surprisingly, he tells them, God has a plan to flourish your life, and God has a plan to flourish this city, and those two flourishings converge. So he tells them, Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 5, plan to stay. Don't be planning your escape from Babylon. Plan to stay. Plant gardens, build homes, marry off your sons and daughters. Pray for the peace and the flourishing of the city, because in her flourishing is your flourishing. The two converge. For St. Mo's, buying this building and fixing this building to be just a gorgeous space for worshiping God and a comfy space for welcoming our neighborhood, that is a concrete next step in our mission of sharing the hope of Christ in the heart of our city, being Baltimore, not Babylon. Last week, we began this series by looking at the heart of giving. If you weren't here for that, I'd encourage you to go back, track it down on our website or on our YouTube channel, not because it was a great sermon, but because the heart is the heart. The heart is what matters. God's after our hearts in this. And that always precedes the things we're going to talk about today, which are the practice of giving. So let me give you a heads up where we're going this morning. That reading we just did, I'm going to very quickly pull out 3 principles, 3 observations from that reading. We're going to move from that to just sort of nuts and bolts of giving here at St. Mo's. And then we're going to finish up by, I'm going to invite 3 of our church members up to share with you about what this giving looks like in their own lives. And importantly, these are people who don't receive a salary from the church, so you can trust them. That's where we're headed this morning. Before we get to that, one caveat. I chose this text because this is one of the beautiful examples in the Word of God of God's people coming together and collectively giving over and above their normal giving in order to fund a building project. So in that regard, it's really similar to what we're doing. And what they're funding is the building of the temple, and what we're primarily working on in this plan to stay effort is renovations on this building. So again, that sounds quite similar, but I want to give you this caveat that at an important point they are very dissimilar, and that is this. In the Old Testament, the first 2/3 of the Bible, the temple building and the things that went on in the temple, namely animal sacrifice and offerings of worship and the teaching of God's law, that was the primary locus, the primary geographical space and temporal space where God's character was unpacked in kind of bite-sized chunks. It was refracted out in ways that people could experience it and appreciate it. You get to the New Testament, and some of Jesus' most shocking words are when he curses the temple. Go check out John chapter 2, for instance. And it's not so much that the temple in and of itself was bad, it's that with the coming of Jesus, God's power and presence was now with his people in the person of Jesus that utterly superseded the temple. Bill Hybels is famous for saying, sometimes when you want people to move beyond the comfortable present they are in and to reach out into the glorious future God has, you've got to tell them, here is horrible. And Jesus helps us to see that comparatively, the temple is horrible in comparison to Jesus. And what the rest of the New Testament goes on to unpack is the fact that all of that refracting of God's character that happened in the temple building in the Old Testament was actually pointing forward to the person of Jesus, and that Jesus has then bequeathed that mission to his followers. So we could say we are successors to the temple, but that would be putting it in the wrong order. It'd be much more accurate to say the temple was a foreshadowing of Jesus, Jesus has bequeathed to us his mission. So the analog for the temple is not this building. It's not the cathedral downtown. It's not the storefront church on the street. The analog to the temple is you guys. The Spirit of God at work in you for power, for change, for hope, for healing in your lives and your families and your friends' lives in this city. All right, caveat done. Let's jump into the text. 3 quick observations. Here's the first one. Okay, you guys, here's the scene, okay? They're going to build this temple, and then God gives David the vision for building a temple. David and the leaders lay out the need, and then David and the other leaders bring all of their resources, make this big pile, and then invite the other people to do so. And the people also contribute their resources. That's what we were just reading about. So here's the first principle. It all belongs to God in the first place anyway. It all belongs to God in the first place anyway. I don't know if you saw this in the text and if it struck you as odd, but it did to me. In verse 13, David, in his prayer, says, "Thank you." All right, why is that odd? Because David has just taken all of his personal treasure. All of the leaders have brought their personal treasure. The people have brought their personal treasure. They put it in a pile in front of God for the purpose of building this building, and then they say, "Thanks, God." Why is that weird? Well, think about Christmas at your house, right? Gifts are being exchanged. Who says thank you? Is it the giver of the gift or the recipient of the gift? It's the recipient of the gift, right? And here the people are amassing this wealth, pouring it out for the purpose of building this temple. It looks like they're giving it to God, but they are the ones who say thank you. And David goes on to explicate, doesn't he, then in the following verses, all of this comes from you in the first place. Verse 11, you are over all things. All of this, verse 13, has come from you, and we give you only what you first gave us. Last week, we talked about the fact that we looked at the text where David said, God, I won't give you what has cost me nothing. Sacrifice matters. That's why we saw that scene where Jesus commended the woman who had given 2 little coins that amounted to like 100th of a day's earnings. Why? Why did he honor her? Because it was sacrifice for her. That was all she had. Sacrifice matters. But if we just ride that train without this corrective, we go off the rails. If we ride the train of sacrifice matters, we think, oh, God, I'm giving you all of my resources. I'm serving at church. I'm serving in nonprofits in the city. Oh, my goodness, look at my sacrifice. God, you owe me. And we get this mindset where God is in our debt. And this corrective says, no, God's not in your debt. What you are giving to him, sacrificially, he gave to you in the very first place. When Kenneth and I were kids growing up, he a little faster than I, our parents, when we were really little, used to give us money and take us to the store so that we could buy Christmas presents for them. Think about that. Why would they do that? It certainly wasn't about efficiency, right? It is less efficient to take a 3-year-old to the store to buy a gift for you than it is to just buy it yourself. Not about efficiency. It's not about the gift, right? I mean, think about the sort of gift a 3-year-old's going to pick out for $2 that is not on your wish list. Why did they do this? Because they were inviting us into the joy of the habit of giving. Do you see that? Everything we have has been given to us first by God. Often on Sunday mornings when we're doing communion, I'll quote the song lyric that says, there's a hook in this meal. To receive is to follow, and we don't always know where. And that song goes on to say, what do I have that is not yours? Curses and thanks on borrowed breath. You guys remember when we looked at the lament psalms and the imprecatory psalms? Even when we're saying to God, gosh, it doesn't even feel like you're good. It feels like you're not here right now. When we express that sort of doubt to God with his words, he's given us those words. He's given us the breath and the blood in our veins to be able to say that to him. Everything we have comes from him in the first instance. What a kind God that he has equipped us with resources and invited us into the joy of giving back to him. If it were just about raising the resources, this is not the most efficient way to do it. But he's invited us into it by giving us the resources and inviting us to give them back to him. Looks to me like that's a lot more about relationship than it is about pragmatics. What a kind God. Let's move on to the second principle. This principle is, if your heart's not in it, then don't do it. If your heart's not in it, then don't do it. Verse 9 says, the people rejoiced over the offerings, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord, and King David was filled with joy. And verse 17 says this, I know, my God, that you examine our hearts and rejoice when you find integrity there. You know I have done all this with good motives, and I have watched your people offer their gifts willingly and joyously. This is tapping into a theme, a much bigger theme throughout the Bible, about the way God works out his purposes in the world. There's a scene many of you will remember in the book of Judges where Gideon is leading God's people into battle against some enemies, and he amasses this little troop, this little army. And God's like, hold on, actually, Gideon, you've got too many people. What? Since when do you have too many people to go into battle? They're already outnumbered, and God's like, no, you got too many. So God says to him, anybody who's recently married, let them go home. Because we all know they've got other things to do, right? Anyway, that was meant to be funny. Guess it was just awkward. You're welcome, newlyweds. And then he takes them to this creek. And he's like, we're going to do this arbitrary drinking test. See the way people drink from the stream. And those who drink a certain way, we're just going to send them home because we still have too many people. And then he's like, anybody who doesn't want to be here, anybody who's afraid, you also can go home. And so they end up with like 4 people going into battle or something like that. It's just insane. Why? Why is this the way God does things? Because God doesn't need the resources. When it comes to winning a battle, when it comes to building a building, when it comes to getting whatever job it is done, God can do it on his own if he wants to. But because he's such an inclusive God, he invites us to participate with him. He invites us along for the ride. He invites those who've got a willing heart. Those who are willing to go into battle against terrible odds. Those who are willing to give sacrificially but joyfully to ride along with him and have a front row seat on his faithfulness, on his goodness, on his kindness and his wisdom, on the dependability of our God. And then he gets the glory. Isn't that magnificent? So I want you to hear this. I've been saying for a few weeks now, our big, bad, audacious, hairy goal in Plan to Stay is 100% participation. If you consider St. Mo's your church home, we would love for you to jump into this investment, even if it's like $5, $10 a month or less. Because we want you to have a front row seat on God's faithfulness. So, if what you are hearing me say is, give us your money, and if in your heart it's raising bitterness towards the church because you feel like the church is always grubbing money off you, and if it's raising in your heart bitterness towards God, don't give. Opt out. We are not arm twisting. This is not a shakedown. There is no tax levied in this text. This is an opportunity for us to joyfully participate, to ride along with God, and to see front row his faithfulness and his goodness and his wisdom as we sacrificially and eagerly contribute out of what he's already given to us. Here's the third point. You guys have heard of alchemy, right? Alchemy, it's like the kind of proto-scientific practice or a field of inquiry where they thought maybe if somebody could figure out how to turn a base metal, an everyday sort of cheap, ordinary metal like iron, into an extraordinary, rare, valuable metal like gold, they would pretty much be winning. They'd be making it rain, right? Alchemy. Never really worked out. But one of the things I love, our chemists are laughing. They're like, actually, I do it. Just haven't patented it. One of the things I love about God is that he's worked this sort of spiritual alchemy into the world. Look at verse 15. David's praying to God with this pile of temporary treasure in front of him, and he says, we're here for only a moment, visitors and strangers in the land. Our days are like a passing shadow, evanescent. Whew. Sun comes up, we're gone. This is David, like rugged survivor David. He's saying, actually, I'm about to pass on. I'm going to be off the scene. And then verse 18, he starts praying about the next generations. Because in his heart, he realizes that this investment into the building of this temple and the instruction that's going to go on there and the worship that's going to go on there will have the potential to impact generations and generations beyond him. Do you see that alchemy? God has worked it into the way the world works that we can take something temporary, something mundane, something ordinary, like our resources, and we can transpose them, I guess would be the musical word. We can transpose them through this spiritual alchemy to be permanent, to be everlasting, to have an impact that outlasts the stars. So we've got X amount of resources. We can use them on vacations. I love vacations as much as anybody. Scratch that, I love vacations more than anybody. We can use them on homes, on saving for education for your kids, on paying bills, on just surviving. All of those things are important. They're good. There's a place for all of those. But we also are invited into the spiritual alchemy, where we invest our temporary money that we can't take with us into the grave. There are no pockets in the shroud. We invest that into God's kingdom work, and it's transposed into everlasting supernatural impact. Your dollars can change destinies through this spiritual alchemy. And that's crazy to think about. And I'm not talking concretely about this building. Like, this is bricks and mortar. It's its own sort of semi-durable, temporary resource. But buildings, too, in this spiritual alchemy, can have an effect on generations and generations and families and neighborhoods and our city and change destinies. God invites us to do this spiritual alchemy with the gifts that he has given us. Let me recap before we get down to nuts and bolts. 3 quick principles. It's all God's in the first place. It's all God's in the first place. Number 2. If you're grumpy about it, don't bother. If you're grumpy about it, don't bother. This is an opportunity for those who have hearts filled with joy and eagerness to give, to ride along front row seats and see what God does. And number 3, let's take the most of this opportunity to participate in spiritual alchemy, to take the resources that God has given you, whatever size they are, and invest them in something that will last, something that's spiritual, something that's permanent. Okay, sermon done. Let's get down to nuts and bolts here quickly. You can go on to the the next slide, which is actually, I think, a PowerPoint. Let's talk about just very practically, how do you give here at St. Mo's? If you want to participate in giving to the life of the church, how do you give? I'm going to talk very generally about giving. That's giving to the general fund, the operating budget of the church, and then I'll also talk more specifically later on about giving to the building fund, the plan to stay, okay? Two very basic ways. The first is hard copy. On a Sunday morning, you can take dollar bills, you can take $100 bills, you can take checks, and you can make them out to St. Moses Church, and in the memo line, you can put general fund, you can put tithe, you can put whatever you want, you can put building fund, and you put it in those offering boxes during the communion time, and we usually flag that. You can put them there in the communion time, you can put them there on your way out. So that's hard copy giving. If that works for you, if that's easiest for you, please do that. For a lot of you, though, you don't carry cash, you don't carry checks, I don't, and electronic giving is the easiest way to give. And I want to talk you through electronic giving at St. Moses because it's clean, it's secure, and it's cost-effective for the church. So that's what I want to take you through very quickly here. If you go to the website, stmos.org, this is what it looks like. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see 3 horizontal bars. That's a menu icon. Okay, you click on that. Next slide. This is what happens when you click on that. You get a drop-down menu, and then you just go down to the Give tab. You click on the Give tab. It'll take you to a giving contributions landing page that will welcome you. It'll tell you that it's secure. It'll give you some instructions, but I'm giving you those instructions now. All you have to do is click on the Contribute button, and it'll take you to the giving portal, which looks like this. Okay? You just fill out those boxes. And the one I want to draw your attention to is the one the drop-down list box that is highlighted there. The default setting there is gifts will go to the general fund. That's the normal operating budget of the church. If you want your gift to go to a different fund, i.e. The plan to stay building fund, you click that list box and you just put your check mark by the building fund. And then you fill out the rest, which is your card number or your bank account number, how frequently you want the gift to happen, that sort of thing. Okay, it's very, very straightforward. You can set up recurring gifts that way. You can set up one-time gifts that way. You can manage that, and it all just happens cleanly and securely. So some of you, I know, want to know about the real nuts and bolts of this. What are the hidden costs? So this is what I want to show you the breakdown for on this next slide. Okay, when you're giving electronically, you have 2 different options. Basically, you can give by credit card or debit card, or you can give by ACH, direct bank account transfer. Okay, this is what I would say to you. There's not a lot in it. If you are using credit card points to pay for your kids' college, then give by credit card. Give by whatever makes the most sense to you. Okay? If, however, it's all the same to you, then it's a little bit cheaper for the church if you give by direct bank account transfer. That's the ACH option. Okay, those are the expenses broken down there. What you need to know is that those expenses are borne on the church's side rather than on your side. So if you give $100 by credit or debit card, what ends up in the church's bank account is $96.80 rather than you paying $103.20 or something like that, okay? So whatever amount you designate is the amount that comes out of your account or credit card, and then the transaction fees are skimmed out of that on the church's end. ACH, direct transfer, is a little bit more cost effective, but there's not a whole lot in it. So if giving from your credit card is something that it makes financial sense for you because you're accruing rewards or something, then we're not discouraging you from doing that. Okay. Does that make sense? Is that clear as mud? Great. Let's move on quickly to talk about how to make pledges to this Plan to Stay campaign. In Plan to Stay, we are inviting you, if St. Moses, your church home, we're inviting you to give over and above your giving to the general operating budget to this $1 million goal of refurbishing this building and of blessing our community, okay? I say that because it would be a little bit counterproductive if everybody who was giving to the church's normal operating budget was like, oh man, a building is exciting, and you just swapped your giving from general fund to building fund. We would have a building, but the lights wouldn't be on, okay? So plan to stay is over and above your giving to the normal operating budget. Next Sunday is our celebration Sunday. We're going to be collecting pledges that Sunday. So if you would like to make your pledge, which I'm hoping you do if you consider St. Mo's your home, 2 ways to do that. You can go right now or this afternoon online to plantostay.stmos.org, and you just fill out the very simple pledge form, okay? That will help us to have a week to kind of tally stuff up. If you need that week to pray, to talk to your spouse, to whatever, figure out what is a good pledge for you, then take the week and just show up next Sunday, and we will have paper pledge cards for you. And you fill those out, and then we'll have a time in the service, which is going to be a fun service with some food and celebration. And we'll have a time during that service when we all get to put our pledges in the offering boxes or some other receptacle. Okay? So that's the way we will make pledges. Next Sunday, November 12th, is the deadline for kind of the people who call St. Mo's home to be making our pledges. All right. A couple more practical questions. Here's one that comes up all the time. How much should I give? How much should I give? Sermon's done. So this is me sharing with you my opinion. So take that for what it's worth, which might not be a lot for you. Debate has raged through the church for 2,000 years about, are church people meant to give a tithe? That's 10% of your income pre-tax to your local church. Are you meant to? Some people say yes, they dig in their heels. Some people say no, they dig in their heels. Some people build a bunch of different nuance onto that. And this is what I want to say. This is my opinion. If you look through the Old Testament, you'll see that God's people are commanded to give a tenth of their produce on this complicated 3-year cycling schedule. And that is part of a bigger scheme of giving that involves a ton of different types of offerings and sacrifices and gifts and building projects. You get to the New Testament, and we don't see that as much as what we see is Jesus ups the ante, as he does, on so many fronts. Remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is like, you look at a woman lustfully in your heart and you've committed adultery? Well, with giving, what we see in the New Testament is things like Romans 12. Your whole life is meant to be a sacrifice, a living sacrifice for God. We see in Acts chapter 2, God's people are living communally, owning property in common. I mean, this is all in. This is radical. And we see regularly throughout Paul's letters, the churches are taking up these really sacrificial offerings to bless other churches that are in a hard way. So I would say, weighing up the various evidence, I would say that for the majority of us, generally speaking, not knowing your individual circumstances, most of us are more affluent than the people in the Bible who were giving 10%. So I'd say that's a good benchmark. That's a good rule of thumb. 10% given to your local church, and then over and above that for other things. However, the theme that runs right the way through is don't be a grumpy giver. Look at what God has given you. Ask him to help you figure out what you can give joyously, what you can contribute to bless his work. Okay, that's the rule of thumb. Some of us, speaking more practically, are in hard situations where you don't have any income, where all of your income is already spoken for, where to give 10% is a real, would be detrimental. And I'd say to you, we're not legalistic about this. Nobody is knocking on your door saying, are you giving 10% and above that to the building fund? Talk to God about it. Settle in your heart what you can give sacrificially and joyously. Some of you are making it rain. You're making a lot of money. And here's what I've noticed working in churches over the years. Often people who are making a lot of money are working a ton of extra hours, or working really hard schedules. And with that, often you can end up in this sort of guilty mindset, like, I'm not able to help out at church. There are other people who are serving in all of these ways. I can't serve. I'm working like 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week. And you start to feel guilty about it. Or the flip side of that, if you're a little less holy, just kidding. The flip side of that is, well, nobody else is making as much money because they're not working as hard as I am. The truth is, God has given his people different gifts. And you might have the gift of making it rain. You might be able to make money in the way other people can't. And I would say, don't feel guilty then if you can't show up to a church Saturday work day. But realize that this is a gift God has given you for the building up of his church. And you should be thinking about how you can use that gift to bless the church, not with 10%, but living well within the means of what God has given you to make and giving big amounts of money to bless your church and other organizations so that you can do that spiritual alchemy. All through the pages of the Bible, all through Christian history, we see people like the wealthy businesswoman Lydia. We see people like Theophilus, who probably underwrote the writing of Luke's gospel in the book of Acts. We see the Second Great Awakening, a bunch of wealthy people in London underwrite things like the abolitionist movement. Other people are doing the work on the ground, but you've got wealthy people who have been gifted with the ability to make money, and they are writing the checks that keep the lights on, as it were. So I'd say to some of you who are college students right now who don't have much of an income, some of you, 10 years from now, when you're long past St. Mo's, you will be making a ton of money. Maybe that is a gift God has given you. And if that's the situation you end up in, you ought to think about how you can live on a little bit of that and give a ton of that for God's kingdom purposes. And do so joyfully and eagerly, knowing that's a gift he has given you to bless the church. In just a moment here, I want to invite up all of our three panelists to ask them some really practical questions. Who has the handheld microphone? Great. So you guys can begin to make your way, or prepare to make your way up here. One more thing that occurred to me just this week as I was wrestling through the way God is after our hearts in this, the way he invites us into worship with our giving. I realized that Jill and I don't carry cash. We don't carry checks. We give electronically to the church. And that means I've sort of cheated my kids out of the opportunity to grow into this joy of giving. Frankly, I've sort of cheated Jill out of it because I'm the one who gets the emails that say, you've given X amount this 2 weeks, and so I get to rejoice, and she's not even really a part of it. So we're thinking through that. We were just talking about it, like how do we help our kids be a part of this? Should we bring $2 and they can stick it in there? Or should we take advantage of the text feature, and I can let Deck use my phone, which he loves to use, to text in $1, and like 30 cents of it will be skimmed off, but who cares? Like the church gets 70 cents, and my kids are learning to participate in the joy of giving. All right, so think about that. Let's help each other think about how we can parent the next generation really well. Perry, come on up. It is a delight to be able to introduce you to Malini and James and Perry, three of our generous church members, and they're all in different life stages. And I just want you to hear authentically from them. We're giving them really straightforward questions about like how did you end up giving to church? What started you on that, and how do you make it work? Like Malini is a full-time student. I'm guessing she's not working 7 other jobs, so I want to just give you guys a chance to share with us. Perry, maybe we'll start with you. If you could stand and just very briefly tell us your life stage, and then tell us how you got into giving.
My name is Perry, and we had 2 daughters, so our girls are out of school. I came to faith later in life, probably 15 years ago, and when I came to church, I asked them what I should give, and they didn't really have any ideas or didn't have any suggestions, so I just went with the 10%. Just as an act of worship, just as we do here every day, I consider it the same thing. What a joy to give back so freely what he's given us.
Awesome. James, this may or may not be true, but I've heard a rumor that when you were really young, you gave away a car. So my first question is, am I making that up? And my second question, probably more important, is, was it your car? Just kidding. Tell us how you got into, James is one of our elders. Tell us how you began the pattern of generosity.
That was my car. So I just going what you're saying about your kids. I saw my parents always giving, and as a kid, we were like, oh, well, I want to put them up in the trays to pass around as well. And just that mindset, growing up in church for, 20 or 18 years before I went to college, like it's just stuck in my head, and then kind of went from that to when I got my first job, and I knew just right away, tithe. And it's a part of life, and like Perry was saying, like it's a gift from God. So just naturally, this is yours, and I just budget like without that money in mind, because it's not mine to begin with.
Awesome, thanks. Malini, you are a college student. The question for you, my question for you is, how do you make it work as a college student? How are you able to be generous when presumably you're not making a ton of money?
Yeah, that's true. Well, I guess my dad always kind of instilled in us the idea of tithing before we even made any money. So then when my sisters and I started to make like little amounts, like $10, $15, like babysitting or something like that, we just wanted to do what he was doing. So we gave 10% to the church, which was like $1 in the thing that passed by, and we like saved 10%. So that was always the model we grew up with. But then as I started to like make more significant amounts of money and like jobs and internships, it just became more something between me and God rather than something technical. And every time I get a paycheck, I just go into my account and try to give before I spend on anything else. And the range, it's not always 10%. Sometimes it's 11 or 12 or 15 or whatever I feel is good between me and God, and it just feels good, like I'm giving him my first fruits of my labor, and it makes me feel a lot more carefree about my money and my resources. So
Thank you so much to the three of you. I just want to name that it's awkward to be called out as generous people and to be invited to speak, so thank you for enduring that. Last thing, I just want to give any of you who want to a moment. Do you have any practical encouragement to other people about how to maybe jump in, ride front seat on, and see God's faithfulness and kindness in giving? Anyone?
So I'm going to go back to the car story. At that time, the pastor in my church had, asked if anyone had a spare car, and I had just started driving. And in that sermon, I just felt God just really impressing my heart, saying, hey, that car that you've been practicing on, I need to go to this family. And it was a woman who was consistently late to work. She was dropping her kids off at daycare and then taking the bus, I think like an hour to her job. And so just knowing that, like, me as a high school student, and I knew I wasn't going to replace the car for my parents. They're like, if you give this away, this is done. I'm like, that's fine. But knowing that...
Can you guys stand up so that people can see?
But just knowing that, like, it was a chance for her to make a difference in her life, to make sure she can provide for her family, just meant the world to me. And I think that's where my spirit kind of comes from, where, like, I just see as giving as opportunity to say, God, I want you to do what you can with this money, because you can do better than I can even think about doing myself.
Awesome. Thanks. Anyone else? Barry?
It's just we just got started doing it. And it wasn't always easy, but by doing it, it was that act of faith, and he's faithful. And it's just it's an outward sign of an inward joy, and it's just a privilege.
Amen. Thank you guys so much. Would you join me in appreciating these three?